Hello, welcome everybody. This is the webinar that NIRS is hosting on state legislative battles in 2025. We're going to be having a series of really great presentations from myself and a couple of grassroots leaders from around the country. And what we wanted to sort of focus this webinar on state policy battles that have been happening this year. Because frankly, when it comes to the construction of nuclear reactors, it's really state policy that has a huge role to play in what happens. And there's also a ton of stuff happening at the federal level, a lot of federal policies that are also really important to what's happening with nuclear energy, including a series of executive orders that President Trump issued a couple weeks ago that have potentially very large impacts, not just on nuclear power plant construction, but on the whole sort of regulatory apparatus and of the in the country. There's also, a lot of things going on at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, new reactor projects that are under review for construction permits. There is an important Supreme Court ruling that could come down within the next few days, and other things like that. But the reality is that almost universally, nuclear power plants in this country are built, have been built, and most of them will be built by utility companies that are regulated by the states. And so, therefore, the policies that states have enacted over the years relating to nuclear energy have played them one of the most pivotal roles in what happens. And so, we're going to delve into that today. And we're also seeing a tremendous amount of legislation and other policy work by states around nuclear energy. Just this year alone, over 200 bills relating to nuclear energy were introduced in state legislatures around the country, in over 40 states. And about 24 of those bills were enacted in about a dozen states. So there's a lot that's changing on the policy front with respect to nuclear energy. And so what we wanted to do today, rather than go through every single, one of those fights, is to highlight some of the major ones that involve the major trends that we're seeing in terms of state legislation and state policy making on nuclear energy. And so we're going to delve into that with in four key states. We're going to start with a presentation by Jamie Valdez of Roots to Resilience on the legislative fights that have been happening in Colorado this year. And then turn to Cathryn Chudy of the Oregon Conservancy Foundation to outline the fights that have been happening in Oregon and Washington State. And then I am going to give an overview of a piece of legislation that was enacted in Maryland this year that could have implications of its own for a bunch of states across the country. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jamie to kick us off. And sorry, in terms of questions and answers, because we have such a huge crowd here today, we're not going to be able to take questions, oral questions from the audience. But please, share your questions in the chat, and we're going to respond to as many of those as we can in the chat, and then pick out the most relevant questions to give to the presenters after the presentations are over. So let's turn it over to Jamie to tell us about what's been happening in Colorado.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get my screen shared. Can everyone see that okay? See a picture of the Pueblo Riverwalk?
That's right.
Awesome. Okay, so just as I'm getting started, I'd like to go ahead and just introduce myself briefly. My name is Jamie Valdez. I also go by and answer to Jaime Valdez. I've grown up answering to both, so I don't necessarily have a preference. I am a native of Pueblo. I was born and raised here. I have lived in other places for brief times in my life here and there, but Pueblo has been my home and is currently my home. And I've got kids and grandkids growing up here in the community, and so I really love this community. What you're seeing here on the slide, for those who don't know, is our beautiful Pueblo Riverwalk. It's one of the many amenities of our community. Um, Although we are a disproportionately impacted community, we still have some really positive aspects to our community. Not the least of which is the people. It's really the people of Pueblo that make this such an awesome place to live. Um, a little bit about Roots to Resilience. Roots to Resilience is an organization founded and led by people from the Pueblo community dedicated to advocacy for Pueblo and Southern Colorado from a local perspective, with a mission of bringing environmental, economic, and social justice to the region. Our vision is we work from the grassroots at the local, state, and national levels to achieve our goal of improving the quality of life for all Southern Coloradans and future generations. One of the projects that we work on in Roots to Resilience is the Nuclear Free Colorado Coalition, and I'll talk a little more about that as I get into the presentation. But the Nuclear Free Colorado Coalition started out as Nuclear Free Pueblo and has grown into a statewide coalition that is now working to help not only Pueblo, but other communities in Colorado that have been targeted by the nuclear industrial complex. Okay, so Pueblo is a disproportionately impacted community, as I was mentioning. Some communities in Colorado have more than their fair share of environmental exposure, which can result in higher levels of environmental health harm. The disproportionately impacted community definition created by state legislature in 2021 identifies areas of Colorado that may experience higher environmental and health burdens like pollution and climate change. In 2023, the state updated the definition of disproportionately impacted community based on recommendations from the Environmental Justice Action Task Force, which I was a member of. So what is the definition? Colorado includes in the definition of disproportionately impacted communities the following factors. So it can include low-income communities, communities of color, housing cost burdened communities, linguistically isolated communities, communities with environmental and socioeconomic impacts, tribal lands, mobile home communities, historically marginalized communities. And as we look at, or I'm sorry, I guess that was the end of that slide. So anyway, Pueblo does fit into this definition of disproportionately impacted community based on our environmental exposure as well as socioeconomic and other factors. Here we see Xcel's Comanche power plant here in Pueblo, which consists of 3 coal-fired units that generate electricity that doesn't even serve the Pueblo community, but instead gets transmitted up north to power mostly Denver area communities. Like a lot of environmental justice communities, we produce products and profits that go elsewhere. Some of the disproportionate impacts that Puebloans experience are increased rates of asthma, COPD, and cardiovascular disease when compared with state averages. Compounding these problems is the fact that we are a low-income community with a median household income that's significantly lower than either that of the state or the nation. Cumulative impacts create a situation where our community, like other sacrifice zones, is somewhat desperate for good jobs and prosperous economy for its citizens. This makes us a target for bottom-of-the-barrel industries such as the nuclear power industry that come into the community and give polished snake oil sales pitches about how their facility will bring jobs and an economic boost while glossing over any hazards. And unfortunately, it far too often works. So just a little bit about how we got here. Back in 2021, our former Pueblo County commissioners hosted a town hall that was actually by invitation only. And so calling it a town hall seems a little bit funny. But anyway, this town hall turned out to be more of a sales pitch from a company called NuScale, which is a manufacturer of small modular reactors which I'll talk a little bit more about in a little later in the presentation. But just kind of just to make a long story short, shortly after that town hall, we convened the first meetings of what would become the Nuclear Free Pueblo team and has now grown into the Nuclear Free Statewide Coalition. So to get to the legislative issues, just earlier this year, there were two major nuclear-friendly bills that we were working on. Among others, there were other bills that were very important to us, but just wanted to highlight these because they are very, very relevant to our topic here today. So House Bill 1040, with the title "Adding Nuclear Energy as a Clean Energy Resource," updates the two statutory definitions of clean energy to include nuclear energy, except that for property valuations made for tax purposes, the Act exempts from the definition of clean energy resource nuclear energy. So what they're doing there is they've defined nuclear energy as a clean energy resource, which is really false in the first place because it creates radioactive waste that remains radioactive for tens of thousands of years, if not more than that. But beyond that, what they're really doing here is taking advantage of a technicality in state law. The definition of clean energy in state law only requires a resource to be carbon free. It doesn't take into consideration other kinds of air pollution or water contamination, soil contamination, and those kinds of things. So it's really missing a lot by defining nuclear as clean. But what this is really doing here is by exempting nuclear energy from the definition of clean energy for the purpose of tax valuation, this makes it more appealing to communities like Pueblo that are transitioning away from coal and are now facing the prospect of losing out on millions of dollars in tax revenue, property tax revenue. By exempting nuclear from the definition of clean energy, that means that nuclear doesn't get the tax breaks that renewable energy resources have gotten in order to encourage their development. And that way, those who are looking to increase tax revenue or keep that tax revenue, nuclear becomes more appealing based on this legislation. It's a little bit tricky to try to explain, but that too is by design. This is House Bill 1040, by the way, was a zombie bill. It was one of these bills that kept coming back year after year after year, and we kept defeating it, kept knocking it down, and it kept getting back up and coming back. And this year, they were able to pass the bill with bipartisan support. Some of our Democratic legislators in the state have mentioned that they were invited to weekend-long workshops by companies like NewScale, where they were given presentations and sales pitches for these nuclear technologies. And so they've really drunk the Kool-Aid and came back this year and were co-sponsors of this bill and had plenty of support to pass this through the legislation. So in Colorado, nuclear energy is now considered a clean energy resource. So it's really never been more important for us to be very, very clear about the renewable energy resources that we want to see in our community, because they cannot pass nuclear off as renewable, even as much as they're trying to pass it off as clean. The other repeated efforts to define nuclear as clean and using the climate crisis as an excuse to slip nuclear into conversations about about energy policy are tactics that we're seeing in Pueblo and other parts of Colorado and seem to be part of the National Nuclear Renaissance campaign strategy. So next we had Senate Bill 25-120 titled Nuclear Workforce Development and Education Program. This bill did not pass but it would have created the Colorado Nuclear Workforce Development and Education Program in the Department of Higher Education Council in the Colorado School of Mines to help meet growing workforce demand in the nuclear energy sector, or claimed workforce demand in the nuclear energy sector. The bill establishes a related grant program to provide grants to institutions of higher education for the development of or expansion of nuclear engineering degree and certificate programs. So as you can see, they're really trying to, one, pass nuclear off as clean and as a solution to the climate crisis. And they're also trying to develop a workforce for these nuclear projects that they're trying to bring to our communities. Next up, we've got consolidated interim storage. As nuclear waste piles up around the country, many communities are saying no to taking it in. But in a rural corner of Colorado, some see the prospect of storing this spent fuel as an economic opportunity. The Associated Governments of Northwest Colorado, or AGNC, a regional economic development group focused on Garfield, Mesa, Moffett, and Rio Blanco counties, has quietly cracked open the door to providing a new home for the nation's nuclear waste. AGNC is one of 14 regional council governments in Colorado and has also accepted tens of thousands of dollars from the federal government to help gauge city and county officials' feelings about building a new repository somewhere in the rural part of the state. The AGNC's stated goal is trying to normalize the idea of importing nuclear waste and to break down a, quote, bad rap. Matt Solomon, who is a spokesperson for the AGNC, is purposefully trying to avoid drawing lots of public attention to his early conversations about nuclear waste storage. At a meeting with the Rio Blanco County Commissioners in November, he explained why. And he says, quote, "I want to be cautious in keeping this a focused meeting, not a public hearing, because we're not at the public hearing part yet." He pointed to environmental activism and public opposition against the idea of creating a nuclear power reactor in Pueblo as a reason to avoid these public hearings. So this is, again, secrecy is often a part of this. Like I said, that town hall that the Pueblo County Commissioners had that turned out to be a sales pitch was very secretive. It was by invitation only. And so a lot of us didn't hear about it until after the thing happened and people were talking about it. So this secrecy isn't, they call this consent-based storage, and it's really kind of an Orwellian term. It would be more accurate to call it manufactured consent-based storage. So this is a picture of what one of the transportation cars would look like. There would be a car on each side of it that would be empty to provide a buffer between this car and any cars that might hold humans or anything else really, but that way to avoid radiation contamination. Heavily fortified trains and trucks would transport this waste along Colorado's highways and rail lines. Armed guards would follow it the entire way, and police would have to be notified along the route. The concrete casks containing the radioactive waste would end up in a facility that looks something like a warehouse. Radiation levels would either be checked occasionally by humans with Geiger counters or eventually robotic sensors. There would be roughly a 2 square mile exclusion zone. Excuse me a second. Oops. Okay, there would be a roughly 2 square mile exclusion zone around the facility for health and safety reasons. Okay, so this is a mock-up basically of what some of these small modular reactors would look like. This is NuScale's design, by the way. And like I said, in 2021, the county commissioners in Pueblo and a few select individuals were given a presentation by NuScale Power concerning the possible replacement of Comanche 3 coal-fired plant with their small modular reactor designs. One thing I want to mention is present at this town hall were the Colorado Energy Office Director Will Torr and former Department of Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm. So this was a big deal, this town hall here in Pueblo. One of the main points to understand here is that these small modular reactors are as yet untested in any real world applications or even a working model. So these mock-ups are really all we have to go on. Okay, so there are a lot of problems with nuclear power generation. I'm just going to try to touch on them very briefly because this slide here could take all day. Nuclear power plants generate electricity from radioactive fuel rods that must be replaced every 24 months. This spent fuel is radioactive waste and must be isolated for tens of thousands of years, if not longer. The vessels in which waste is stored can corrode and leak over a much shorter time, with the potential for contamination of land and water, not to mention they are susceptible to seismic activity and attacks by those who might seek to do us harm. Any community with a nuclear reactor will be burdened by also having to store the radioactive waste produced on site for potentially tens of thousands of years. We would be handing that problem down to our progeny to try to solve. National Academy of Sciences stated in their proceedings of National Academy of Sciences on May of 2022, our results show that most small modular reactor designs will actually increase the volume of nuclear waste in need of management and disposal by 2 to 30 times for reactors in their case study. Multiple studies, including studies at Stanford, the University of British Columbia, Stanford and the University of British Columbia have shown that small modular reactors, as proposed for Pueblo, generate more nuclear waste than conventional plants, according to these research studies. Right now, there is no solution for waste disposal. There is no repurposing, there's no recycling going on anywhere in the United States. So this is a problem without any solution right now. And it's really important that we clean up the waste we've already created before we go creating building reactors that are going to generate more. Water usage is another problem. These nuclear reactors, small modular reactors, use a lot of water. Puebloans can unfortunately tend to get lulled into a false sense of water security because we have the Pueblo Reservoir and the beautiful, awesome Arkansas River. But what many residents of Pueblo and other Front Range communities may not realize is that at any given time, up to 60% of the water flowing down the Arkansas comes from the western slope through the Frying Pan Trans Mountain Diversion, bringing water to the Front Range from the Frying Pan River, which is a tributary to the already overused Arkansas River. Nuclear power plants require uranium, which must be mined and enriched. Marginalized communities bear a disproportionate burden of the environmental and health impacts of uranium mining and enriching. Just upstream from us here in Pueblo, we have the Cotter Uranium Mill in Fremont County near Canyon City, which is now a Superfund site with no plans for cleanup. This plant was labeled a Superfund site 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago, and they still don't have a plan for cleanup. Even industry insiders admit that any new nuclear development will take a minimum of 10 years to complete, and that's an extremely generous time frame. With the climate crisis as it is, we simply do not have that much time. And nuclear is the most expensive way to generate electricity currently known at utility scale. So this graph is pretty self-explanatory. It shows how long various energy generation resources take to come online once construction is started. I would ask you to note how long natural gas combustion turbine and combined cycle natural gas take compared to solar PV and batteries, and especially notice how long nuclear takes there at the bottom of the graph. It's nearly off the charts. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said we had roughly 12 years to drastically reduce carbon emissions if we hope to avoid the worst of climate catastrophe. Reports released since then say the problem is even more dire than that. Pueblo does not have to continue to be used as a sacrifice zone for bottom-of-the-barrel polluting industries. We deserve better and can have better. In 2017, Pueblo was recognized by SolSmart with their Bronze Award, designating our community as one of the nation's solar-friendly communities. And with more than 300 days per year of sunshine and plenty of wind whipping around the foothills and plains, and even the potential for geothermal, Pueblo is poised to be a national leader in renewable energy sources like wind and solar. Our elected officials need to be encouraged to continue this path toward a brighter future, more sustainable, toward a brighter, more sustainable future powered by renewable energy. So Xcel Energy's coal-fired plant here in Pueblo is retiring, and discussions are underway for replacement options. An ideal solution that could foster economic development in the city could be the renewable energy parks concept. Energy parks integrate multiple renewable energy sources like energy sources and storage solutions like batteries, and potentially co-locate with electric consumers such as factories or data centers, all connected to the grid at a single point. Replacing the Comanche coal plant with an energy park would facilitate a more affordable, reliable, resilient, and clean Colorado grid. It would also provide around $40 million annually in replacement property tax for Pueblo County. It would stimulate economic development and job creation and make Pueblo a statewide and even national leader in the energy transition, all while minimizing the financial, planning, and operational risk through a diverse approach to reliable supply of electricity. I'm sorry about that. I have a link here that I can share in the chat in just a minute. There is a report on energy parks, and I would encourage folks to take a look at that. And to close, I just want to say Pueblo, once again, is well positioned to become the renewable energy capital of Colorado, not a sacrifice zone for false climate solutions, many of which are as yet untested in any real-world applications. Pueblo and other communities like Pueblo deserve better than that. Thank you. Please feel free to reach out. My contact information is here, as well as the contact information for Roots to Resilience. And we'd be glad to also include you in our correspondence for the Nuclear Free Colorado Coalition.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. That was really terrific. And also, we encourage, anyone who's excited by the work that that Roots to Resilience and Oregon Conservancy Foundation and NIRS are doing, to also show your support with a contribution. And so, we're happy to share a link to Roots to Resilience in the chat, and we'll all now move on to Cathryn's presentation about what's been going on in Oregon and Washington. Welcome, Cathryn. Yes, we can see your screen. It looks great.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, hello, everybody. My name is Cathryn Chudy, and I am with the Oregon Conservancy Foundation, which is a regional nonprofit foundation that supports environmental protection, reverence for life, and human rights. And I actually came to Oregon back in 1977. I've been here for 48 years, and during that time, I have lived in both Oregon and Washington. So I'm going to cover nuclear legislation in both Oregon and Washington. And back in 1977, when I came, Oregon had an operating nuclear power plant. And within the next few years, we saw increasing problems, including the 3 Mile Island disaster. And Oregon, as a progressive state, has an initiative and referendum process that allows citizens to enact laws and to amend laws, and sometimes even to amend the Constitution. So in 1980, we used that initiative process to pass the 1980 ballot measure law that set 2 requirements for any nuclear power plant that would be sited in Oregon and built in Oregon. Once there is a permanent federally licensed repository for terminal disposition of its high-level nuclear waste, and if that is operating, if that repository is operating, then to preserve the choice and the option for Oregon citizens, there has to be a statewide vote of the people. And amazingly enough, in 45 years, no nuclear power plants have been built in Oregon. We're one of 9 states that continue to have a moratorium, but it has been hard within the last 10 years to keep the last decade to keep it because of the resurgence of nuclear. So in the state of Oregon, like a lot of states, we have clean energy legislation that's been enacted in order to transition us away from fossil fuels and into a lowered emission and much healthier environment. And so in 2021, Oregon adopted its clean electricity bill, which set clean energy targets and provided provisions that determined which resources could be used to meet those targets as we transition in the direction of no fossil fuel emissions. And the nuclear lobby was quite active at that time and got the state of Oregon to include, the legislators to include non-emitting electricity, which is a definition that says that if there's no no greenhouse gases in the form of carbon generated where the energy is produced, that could be a resource that could be used in Oregon. So this is a very narrow definition. It magically turns nuclear power into clean energy. And if nuclear power is allowed to be sited in Oregon, it could then compete for funding with renewable energy that's actually clean, economical, and available now, as opposed to nuclear, which is extremely expensive, extremely unclean, and not available for a long period of time. So what's been happening in Oregon's legislature? Over the last decade, there have been bills introduced that are targeted to amend or repeal Oregon's ballot measure law. And Jamie talked about NuScale. NuScale originates out of Oregon in Corvallis at the Oregon State University. It developed and is still promoting the NuScale design, which has received certification, but that certification did have some indication that there were still state safety problems. And NuScale was part of the nuclear lobby that tried to overturn Oregon's ballot measure law. After the 2021 clean electricity law was passed, we saw an increase in the frequency and the number of bills, which brings us to this legislative session, 2025. And here you see 13 bills. I'm not going to go through them all, but 10 of these bills are specifically geared toward repealing Oregon's 1980 ballot measure law or exempting it so that nuclear could somehow have a workaround. 2 of the bills are study bills, which by their sponsors were intended essentially to give promotional advantage related information to the Oregon legislature. Public input led to at least one of those bills being amended so that there would be the drawbacks or the downsides to nuclear included. And one of those bills creates an income tax credit for energy production in Oregon, which includes nuclear energy. We're still in the session. We have a couple weeks to go. And out of those 10 bills that would repeal or exempt Oregon from the current law, nuclear from the current law, 3 of those bills had hearings in the Senate. 2 of those bills had public hearings and actually made their way to the Joint Ways and Means Committee, which would be poised to go to the other chamber and potentially be passed. But Oregon has a very significant budget shortfall. And so those bills currently are not advancing, and we're hoping that our efforts with we had a rally day, a nuclear-free lobbying day. The Sierra Club is giving a lot of input and had a lobby day that included lobbying legislators about nuclear. We have a coalition of many of the environmental justice and environmental groups in Oregon that we do outreach with to show up for hearings. When the hearing was held for this House Bill 2410, we were over 2-to-1 testimony in opposition to this bill. And this bill is very clever. The one we're most worried about, it's House Bill 2410, which would exempt a small modular nuclear reactor demonstration project from the statewide law, allow one county in the state to have that small modular nuclear reactor demonstration program, which does 2 things. It gets around the no siting of a nuclear power plant until there's a permanent repository, and it also allows only one county to vote instead of statewide vote. So in the meantime, what's happening in Washington's legislature? Washington in 2019 passed its Clean Energy Transformation Act, which again allowed nuclear to be part of the definition for what's a resource that could be used to lower emissions and meet the requirements of this clean energy transmission. And it's based on the claim that nuclear power does not emit carbon at the generating site. Nuclear becomes clean. Unfortunately, Washington state doesn't have a 1980 ballot measure law like Oregon. And this whole idea of equating nuclear with clean is something we've seen across the country. We see it in every article we read. Reporters often just use the 2 words interchangeably. But and those of us who are opposed to nuclear see nuclear power, calling nuclear power clean as an affront to science and common sense, which is a wonderful quote by Michael Mariotti from July 2014. So, Washington does not have a ballot measure law to keep nuclear power from expanding or being promoted, but it does have an operating nuclear power plant, and that's the Columbia Generating Station at Hanford. And Energy Northwest is a consortium of public utilities and municipalities that operates and owns the Columbia Generating Station nuclear power plant. And when the CETA law, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, was passed in 2021, X-Energy, which is a nuclear design and nuclear fuel company out of Maryland, saw Washington as the state that X-Energy wanted to target in order to bring its small modular nuclear reactor design. And so they've partnered with Energy Northwest, and in 2023, Energy Northwest and X-Energy signed a joint development agreement to build up to 12 small modular nuclear reactors at Hanford, which also happens to be the most toxic place in America, with vast amounts still of highly toxic, radioactive, high-level nuclear waste and chemical waste that is still in the cleanup process. It's extremely expensive to do one of these startups. So Energy Northwest is seeking funding any way it can. It does believe that because it believes this is going to be a benefit to the state of Washington, that public dollars should be allotted to their effort to pursue these small modular nuclear reactors at Hanford. And so in 2024, they were able to get a budget appropriation of $25 million out of Washington State's clean energy funds. And this was opposed by the affected tribes, Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla and the Yakima Nation, and it was opposed by the Sierra Club. Many of the people who oppose nuclear made every effort to keep this funding from being passed, but the nuclear lobby is very strong, and so one of the strategies for pro-nuclear forces in Washington is to get financial assistance from the public dollars in order to leverage federal dollars. So the final thing they're going to try to do is seek federal taxpayer loan guarantees for up to 80% of the nuclear power project costs, which ultimately means that we as taxpayers are hit in both directions by funding these things that are far off and extremely expensive. So what's happening this year in our legislative session, it is concluded. These were the four main bills that were introduced. And again, they reflect looking for pathways for nuclear subsidies and also inserting pro-nuclear promotional language into the statutes to bolster the effort to get funding from Washington dollars. So there's a bill that wanted to create a commercial liftoff for energy from Advanced Nuclear Advisory Commission. There's a commercial liftoff for energy from Advanced Nuclear Study. And none of these bills were able to make it out of committee. Again, we were able to mobilize testimony, and the final bill is a tax break bill that comes out of the Tri-Cities area. The representative who represents the Tri-Cities wants to extend the current targeted urban tax area preferences in order to allow sufficient time for a nuclear fuel facility to be sited there and to see it as a location for their nuclear to essentially produce HALEU fuel, not just for the reactors that would be at Hanford, but globally. So this is a big deal, $4.5 billion worth of economic development in the Tri-Cities area. And again, we were able to persuade the majority leader of the Senate to not bring it to the floor. It got very close to being passed, but he said that he was swayed by public testimony that there is no safe place to store nuclear waste in Washington or elsewhere, and he could not see the Washington State Legislature giving material support to the nuclear expansion efforts. So we're really appreciating that, Senator, and we'll continue our outreach for next year. And we're absolutely convinced that humanity must shift from living on the earth to living with her, and nuclear certainly doesn't fit that framework. So thank you for your time and attention.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. And, just congratulations and great work to y'all in Oregon and Washington for holding back such a deluge of bad legislation. And if you feel up to it, you could share, a way for folks to support y'all's work. That would be really great. And so with that, I'm gonna share with y'all one of the major pieces of legislation that was enacted in Maryland this year. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. And I'm going to start with some sort of introductory comments about, the financing of nuclear energy projects. But the kind of the reason we wanted to highlight this legislation in Maryland this year is because it is sort of a first of a kind piece of legislation that a state has enacted that could open up the possibility for new reactor construction in a bunch of states that have essentially been immune from that for the last 25 years. And I'll explain a bit about that in a minute. Um, so Maryland enacted the Next Generation Energy Act this year, and it provides a model for for what we call merchant nuclear power plant construction, and that has to do with the states in which they deregulated their electricity markets a quarter century ago, where power plants ostensibly have to compete on the market to sell their electricity. And that setup has effectively blocked reactor construction in those 20 or so states. But this legislation that Maryland passed this year could change that if other states adopt it as well. So just some basics about nuclear economics and finance, and Jamie talked a bit about this before, but as we know, nuclear power plants have extremely high construction costs. The new reactors that were built in Georgia, Vogtle 3 and 4, those cost what's called, the in a unit measure, $16 million per megawatt of capacity, or $36 billion, for the 2,200 megawatts of power that they generate. In terms of SMRs, the new scale model that Jamie talked about, that was estimated to cost $20 million per megawatt before NuScale's first project was canceled a year and a half ago. That compares to solar, utility scale solar and onshore wind, which are a fraction of that, at $1 million to $1.5 million per megawatt. So even when you count the fact that solar and wind produce power what they call intermittently, the actual cost of solar electricity and wind electricity versus nuclear electricity is far, far less. Nuclear plants are also plagued with long construction times. So Vogtle 3 and 4 took 11 years to build from the time that they started the nuclear construction piece of the project. By contrast, onshore wind and solar take 1 to 2 years to build once they actually start construction. And offshore wind, even though you're building offshore and all the complications from that, once construction starts, gets built very rapidly in 2 years or less. In terms of financing nuclear projects, which is the big issue here, lenders don't want to wait 10 years or more for loan payments to start. They're not willing to wait for the nuclear plant to be built to start taking payments on the billions of dollars in loans they have to give out to these projects. And in addition, the cost overruns and construction delays that are endemic to nuclear projects increase the risk of default on those loans because of the high cancellation rates and the potential that the projects ultimately aren't going to move forward. So there's what I've sort of characterized as several laws of nuclear economics, and I won't go into depth on all of these, but they'll be available in the slides for you to download later. But that sort of underscores these basic points: that nuclear construction is expensive, that it's plagued with delays and cost overruns, and some important facets that go into this. That the projects have to appear to be economical at the start. And so that means that that projects get approved with unrealistically low construction cost estimates. But once the construction gets underway and thousands of workers have been hired, billions of dollars have been spent in the first few years, once the cost overruns start to become apparent, it becomes then politically controversial to cancel these projects. And so, we've seen what happened, for instance, in South Carolina and Georgia, that cover-ups are an attractive alternative to the truth, at least until the truth catches up with them. But the timeline to project failure outlasts election cycles. And so the decision makers, the politicians and utility commissioners that approve projects are able to avoid accountability because failure happens years after they've left office. But in the end, ratepayers and taxpayers have to pay our bills, or else we get our power shut off, or we get our houses seized, or our apartments evicted from. So there are several models for nuclear finance in the U.S. that basically, make all of these projects possible despite all of these problems. The first and most important historically has been what's called construction work in progress, which is a state policy for utility commissions that allows utilities to charge ratepayers for the cost of nuclear construction before the power plants ever generate electricity. And this costs ratepayers billions of dollars in rate hikes without even receiving any electricity. There's also been repeated bailouts of what's called utilities stranded costs. That's the debt that they can't get recovered through their rates, but then ratepayers end up paying for anyway. The federal government has, for the last 20 years, provided loan guarantees. These are essentially forgivable loans that they don't have to, the company doesn't have to pay back if if the project defaults. There's also various kinds of tax rebates, investment tax credits, and production tax credits that are basically, are direct payouts from the U.S. Treasury to the companies that build reactors. There's also what states have created, and now the federal government is sort of providing a version of this, zero emissions credits. This is essentially a direct subsidy to uneconomical nuclear reactors on the basis of their avoided greenhouse gas emissions. And then there's things like above market power contracts, essentially contracts that pay for power at prices that are above what you can get through the electricity market. But in terms of ratepayer financing, which is, the dominant way in which reactors have been built in the US, to this date, even in 2025, all the reactors that have been built in the US have been built by utilities that have been able to charge their ratepayers for the cost through rates that are approved by utility commissions. And so even in the states that deregulated, all those reactors were originally built by utilities that charged their ratepayers for the cost of construction. And so the merchant companies that now own those reactors in states like Maryland and New York and Pennsylvania and Illinois, those reactors were built by utilities on the backs of ratepayers. And those rates, guarantee a profit through what's called a return on investment. And so it's very profitable for utilities that can get nuclear projects approved to have those go over budget, because then they're going to be making a 10% profit on an even higher original cost. This is where construction work in progress financing comes in. It authorizes utilities, or it basically exempts them from the normal rules for cost recovery in their rates that basically usually require a piece of infrastructure, whether it's a power plant or a power line or a substation, to be completed and in use before they're able to charge customers for the cost of that. This allows utilities to charge ratepayers for the interest payments on their loans while construction is happening. And so as construction costs are going up, those interest payments are going up, and more cost is being borne by ratepayers, even though they don't receive any electricity till many years later. So under the nuclear renaissance that was declared 20 years ago, there were 31 reactor projects that were proposed. 20 of those were proposed under QIP type rate making, either by states that had enacted QIP legislation for utilities, or utilities like the Tennessee Valley Authority that effectively can set their own rates and charge consumers for whatever costs they absorb. And only the reactors that were, in states that had QIP policies began construction. So to kind of give a sense of how this played out in the past, there were over 270 reactors proposed in the U.S. in the early years of the industry. About half of those were canceled. Only 134 reactors were built and entered operation. And a third of those basically have already been retired. But through that first generation of nuclear construction, construction delays and cost overruns increased over time. It didn't get cheaper or any faster to build reactors. It actually got longer and more expensive to where the last reactors were averaging 14 years to build, and the costs averaged more than 3 times what their original estimates were. Some exceeded 10 times what their original cost estimates were. What happened as a result of this was that there were a lot of reactors that were ordered by utilities when it looked like nuclear power was going to be cheap. But by 1978, the last nuclear reactors were put on order, and from that point on, construction started to decline to where basically after 1996, there were no reactors being built in the U.S. And it had started to peter out well before then. Um, as a result of the massive cost overruns that were happening with utilities building reactors across the country, utility rates were starting to skyrocket in the 1980s. There was a lot of consumer dissatisfaction. There was a lot of embarrassing mismanagement of projects. There were utility commissions and state legislators were under a lot of pressure to justify why this was all happening. And so that started to lead to a series of things that resulted in this proposal for utility deregulation that happened in the 1990s, or utility restructuring, it's often called, where states required utilities, about half the states in the country, required utilities to separate off their generation assets, that's the power plants, from their core business of transmitting and delivering electricity to customers. And so in a bunch of states, this resulted in the establishment of wholesale or merchant power markets where electricity generators had to bid to sell their power on the market. And that meant that generators basically have to sell electricity at relatively competitive rates. And there's lots of rigging of these markets, and it's not exactly competition all the time. But that meant that there were no reactors built by merchant power companies under deregulation until now. This bore out in the nuclear renaissance that was declared 20 years ago when the federal government passed for the first time direct subsidies and financing for nuclear projects. And there were 30 new reactors proposed. A bunch of them, they all applied for licenses. 14 of those licenses were issued before the other ones, the companies decided to cancel their plans for licenses. There were 4 reactors that began construction. Those were the 4 reactors in South Carolina and Georgia. When those projects bankrupted Westinghouse, the summer reactors in South Carolina were canceled. This resulted in a 93% cancellation rate of nuclear projects under the nuclear renaissance. And the 2 reactors that were finished came in at more than 2.5 times later than they were expected, and more than 2.5 times their original budget. And again, no merchant reactor projects even began construction under the nuclear renaissance. So this brings up what Maryland has just done, which is in the Next Generation Energy Act, which is a large bill that includes a lot of different things, including fast tracking the construction of natural gas plants, but also some good things like removing trash incineration from the renewable energy standard and requiring that utilities demonstrate there will be public benefits to their rate increases. But the unique thing about the Next Gen Act is this nuclear financing model for merchant power plants, for merchant nuclear reactors. And so this legislation resolves 2 financing obstacles for nuclear construction in deregulated states. It's based on Maryland's offshore wind procurement. So there's a lot of states, especially in the Northeast, that have created new processes for procuring offshore wind projects that Maryland sort of, kind of carbon copied to now use for nuclear construction. It authorizes what they call a long-term pricing schedule. It's basically a 30-year contract between the state, the Public Service Commission, and the developer of a nuclear power plant that guarantees the recovery of the approved costs. And it also applies not just to new reactors, but also to what are called power uprates for existing reactors. And then based on the gap between whatever the market prices for electricity are and these approved costs, translates that into utilities that have to buy zero emissions credits that are going to be charged directly to customers to pay for the actual costs of the nuclear plant construction. And it requires two things of state agencies. One is for the Maryland Energy Administration to pursue cost sharing agreements with neighboring states, essentially to try to rope other states into helping pay for these new reactors that would be built in Maryland. And then it orders the Public Service Commission to do the hard work, which is to procure new reactors. So it requires the PSC to accept a proposal from a company that wants to build a new reactor, and then to open up a period for other companies to also submit proposals. And then it has to do this at least two more times in the next 5 years by 2031. So essentially three procurements for new reactors in Maryland. It requires the PSC to set pricing standards that would essentially sort of, set a ceiling for how much of an impact this could have on consumers' bills. But it also directs the PSC to keep these pricing standards confidential, so no one knows what they are. It includes a number of sort of public benefit standards, including things like, making sure that minority and women-owned businesses, are considered for construction contracts during these projects. A community benefits agreement with the local community. It requires the company to evaluate impacts on consumers and market prices. And those sort of things. It oddly enough only requires the PSC to determine what the environmental and health benefits of the nuclear project are, not any negative impacts. It does include a couple of limitations that are significant. First, unlike the QIP policy that I mentioned before, there can be no payments to the company until the reactor generates electricity. And it also says that the ratepayers in the state have to be, quote, held harmless for cost overruns, which ostensibly means that if there are cost overruns, that the state and the ratepayers don't have to pay them. But there's some real implications to this, which make it a real mixed bag. First is that it does create a model that other states can copy for financing nuclear projects in these deregulated markets. So we do expect that in the coming years, there's going to be a lot of other states where there's interest in nuclear power to adopt policies like this. But it also has really ineffective cost controls. So the fact that there's no financing charges to customers before the reactor begins construction may kill any potential for reactor projects for the reasons I sort of laid out before. But this also provides really false assurances on cost overruns. First of all, as we've seen, in utility commission after utility commission, despite the fact that the projects are approved at a much lower cost than they end up costing, the utility commissions end up approving the cost increases. And so that could happen in Maryland the same, just as well as it can happen in Georgia and South Carolina and every other state. And the reality is that politics override policy. That once thousands of jobs have been created, to build reactors and billions of dollars have been spent, it becomes really politically unpopular or difficult to pull the plug on a project just because it went over budget. And so it's sort of, you sort of end up very quickly, in a frog in a boiling pot scenario, where, the cost overruns are happening, but they keep on allowing the cost to go up in order to avoid, putting construction workers out of work and wasting billions of dollars. And then concretely, it also will block the transition to renewable energy. The fact that in Maryland, for instance, now we're going to have three different procurement periods where the PSC is going to be tied up in having to evaluate these really complicated and expensive projects. It means that they're not going to have time and capacity to review renewable energy projects and plan the renewable energy transition. And, and then on top of that, once the PSC approves a nuclear project, then it's in the position of having to guarantee that there's going to be a market for its electricity. So even if, we could build renewable energy 10 times faster than it takes to build a nuclear plant, once the state's committed to have to pay the cost of building that nuclear plant, then the PSC is basically going to have an incentive to slow down the development of renewable energy, which is just crazy given the climate crisis and given the impact on ratepayers. So that sort of, is kind of an overview of what we can expect from this legislation. And we hope, we can start fending off in other states, if the same thing is proposed there. So why don't we wrap up the presentations and jump into questions and answers. And so, Anne, do you want to feed us the questions that came out of the chat?
Absolutely. We have, will NIRS be pressing for the immediate closure of all power reactors if Trump shuts FEMA down? Lacking FEMA, the reactor utilities emergency plans are all voided, requiring immediate shutdown.
So this is a really compelling argument.
Interesting.
I mean, NIRS pushes for the immediate closure of all reactors anyway. Um, you know, and so I think, if in fact FEMA is defunded, this is going to be a really important case to make. The reality is that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission effectively stopped requiring there to be FEMA approved emergency plans for reactors many, many years ago. And so, we've pushed for this in the past, especially after Fukushima, but in the years before that as well. And the NRC, basically, thumbed its nose at those requirements for emergency plans. But it is an important case to make, and I think it's an important one that we'll raise for sure.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. Next, we have a question regarding data centers. How can we resist demands for nuclear power for data centers?
I'll throw it to Cathryn and Jamie if you've got any insights on this.
Well, I think giving people information about water usage and electricity usage and raising questions about who's actually paying for that, how is it pointing the focus in the direction of impacts on people who live near data centers, people who are seeing their electric rates go up and are already concerned. So looking at the implications and the impacts rather than the focus that data centers have on this is necessary. And I think actually raising the question of, do we really need to pursue AI? What are the downsides to AI? And then also finally pointing attention to, for instance, back in the 70s in the state of Washington, there were forecasts for huge load increases, and they had the 5 nuclear power plants of the Washington Public Power Supply System vetted and ready to go, and some of them actually started to be built. And then that magically that disappeared. That load forecast was inaccurate. And so we need to raise questions about it. We need to engage people to learn more and to ask questions. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, and I would add that data centers take about 18 months to build. They don't take very long to build, whereas a nuclear reactor takes at least 15 years. A lot of industry insiders are even saying longer than that. So the timeframes just really don't match up. The two don't pair well based on that. But also, if you take a look at what happened in one day to the AI market when DeepSeek released their article talking about how energy efficient their technology was, this AI market is really an unstable market, it seems like to me, and we have no idea what new technological advances are going to do to that market as time goes forward. And if we keep basing our energy needs on this AI, this developing AI technology, what we're likely to end up with is a lot of energy, stranded energy assets.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jamie. And in fact, one of the things that could be really important, and we actually saw a piece of legislation like this in Maryland that didn't pass this year, but that would have created that would, hopefully it'll pass next year, but that would create energy efficiency standards for data centers. So the principle, just like we have energy efficiency standards for refrigerators and cars, we should have them for data centers too, especially given the huge pressures that they're imposing on our energy system.
Great. Thank you guys for answering that. And one of the final questions I saw in our chat, which is kind of the big question with nuclear, with all of these disadvantages, why is anyone proposing this? Is it just money or are they just crazy?
Again, I'll
Both.
turn it over to you guys just, for what's happening in your states.
I'd say, well, I think the nuclear propaganda machine is massive, and the fact that our taxpayer dollars are going to persuade communities that this is a good thing and it's a positive thing, it's a necessary thing. I think that's a big challenge. And when we hear that the polls show that people across the country are now in favor of nuclear and give a substantial majority of, really it depends on what questions they're asking. And there are a lot of people out there who are perhaps younger, who aren't as familiar with the disasters that have occurred and the risks and the harms. And quite frankly, people are too exhausted trying to just survive and stay alive to pay attention. So I think all those things are a factor in it.
I definitely agree with that. Everything you said, that Cathryn, and I would add that the like Cathryn said, that the nuclear industrial complex has huge amount of funding resources to throw at this propaganda machine, and some of that money is being used to specifically court our legislators. And like I mentioned in my presentation, one of our state legislators has told multiple people that in our environmental justice circles that he was invited to a weekend long workshop by NuScale or one of these uh, manufacturers of small modular reactors, and at this weekend long workshops they're propagandizing them. They're presenting presentations like the ones that they gave to our county commissioners here in Pueblo, and um, only this is a whole weekend long thing where they have the chance to really kind of butter them up, feed them good meals, and set them up in a nice fancy resort or whatever, and really butter them up literally. So it's really important for us to keep an eye on what's going on in our states, keep an eye on what our legislators are doing, and keep trying to talk to them about these issues and let them know that we don't support nuclear development in our communities. We don't want to be used as guinea pigs, and we're not falling for the snake oil sales pitches.
Yeah, and I think that point that you raised, Jamie, about the role of money in politics and the way that these corporate lobbies work. There's actually a really great documentary on if you got access to HBO or Max, that details this nuclear corruption scandal that took place in Ohio several years ago, in which the utility company basically bought legislation to bail out their nuclear plants with $60 million in dark money contributions to politicians. And it really shows you in sort of on the inside how this, kind of corporate influence works, with legislators. Um, but I think there's other things that are happening too, which is that, that the utility industry has been working really hard for decades to block renewable energy and these what have proved to be our best energy sources, in the last several years, despite all this corporate lobbying. Um, but in states like Maryland and New York, the utilities have still been really effective at blocking renewable energy from expanding. And so we have states that are trying to figure out ways to meet their climate goals, with this elephant in the room, which is that we're not developing renewable energy in many of these states fast enough. And so politicians are also sort of desperate for solutions. And you have, this nuclear lobby coming in like the knight on the white horse with all of these false solutions. That is, that is making itself seem really attractive, given the frustration that people are feeling about how do we get solar built, how do we get wind built, how do we get offshore wind built, and get that transition really going at scale. And so, unfortunately, the utilities are seizing this as an opportunity to promote nuclear as a way to further delay the transition to renewable energy and to keep their dirty energy sources going.
So I think we shouldn't assume that our legislators are not resisting the nuclear money. We should follow the money. We should also not assume that our legislators are doing their due diligence in terms of challenging or questioning the claims that are being made, which requires a lot of outreach to legislators, to committee chairs, the energy committee chairs. And also, I think I saw someone in the chat that talked about the Public Utility Commission. That is an avenue as well that is supposed to address, have ratepayers' interests in mind. And I think people kind of miss that their Public Utility Commission for their county may not have as much information or may be persuaded, and we need to get involved in those arenas as well.
Good point. Anne, anything else in the chat?
I don't think I saw any direct questions that weren't already answered. But if you have any final questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I see Connie has her hand raised. I don't know if with our settings, if we can view that, or Connie, if you want to put your question into the chat, we can get to it as well.
Yeah, so as Connie may be doing that, I'll turn it back to Jamie and Cathryn if you've got any final words you want to share with the audience today.
I guess I would just offer appreciation for everyone out there that's paying attention and that is getting involved in some way. There are a lot of different ways. If you don't have a lot of time, you can still connect with your legislator, your representative, your within the state, and let them know that you oppose nuclear expansion, or if you're in a moratorium state, that you oppose getting rid of that moratorium, because I think they do pay attention to what they hear from their constituents, and you can be a conduit for an alternate point of view than that they're getting from the nuclear lobbyists. So you can raise good questions, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind just as an individual citizen.
Yeah, we still live in a democracy and we should use it, right?
Yes, yes.
Yes, absolutely. That's so important. And I would I think I would emphasize Tim's point about, or maybe it was Cathryn, about getting involved with the Public Utilities Commission. They tend to have a lot of power over these decisions of what electric generation resources end up in or near our communities. And there are many different ways that you can get involved in those processes, from obtaining legal intervener status to just helping to do outreach in your community to drive public comment, and also submitting public comment yourself in written and or oral form. You can do both, either or both. So I really encourage folks to get involved with those state regulatory agencies like the Public Utilities Commission, and there are several others in our states. Like in Colorado, we've got the Air Pollution Control Division and Water Quality Control Division, and all these state agencies that are approving permits to pollute our air, our water, and our soil. And we really need to be diligent and paying attention to what these regulatory agencies are allowing because a lot of times our communities don't know about the hazards and risks until they become problems and sometimes Superfund sites in our community.
Yeah, and I think what I would add too is that, the importance of, the basics of, of organizing and education and public outreach. Like, we a lot of times feel really marginalized working on nuclear issues because it seems like, no one else is paying attention. But what I've seen, in the climate movement over the last several years, that that a lot of other groups, whether from the grassroots, up through national coalitions, are getting more and more alarmed about the promotion of nuclear and the way that it's derailing what they've been pushing for years, which is really a phase out of fossil fuels and a transition to renewable energy. And so the more that we really do have a lot of friends and allies out there that are eager for the information we have to share. And so, to be getting involved and, and expanding, coalition, climate justice coalitions and environmental justice coalitions, to work together to fight this stuff is really, really important. And, to what Cathryn was saying, we're not, we need to exercise the democratic powers that we have, to be able to beat back this industry, and our survival is dependent on it now. So, okay, well, we'll wrap up there. So thank you everyone for sticking it out. We went over time, but this seemed like a really important batch of information to share. Really grateful for Jamie and for Cathryn, for your presentations today and for the amazing work that you guys are doing. And we'll be, holding more webinars like this in the coming months, highlighting different issues, and and so please pay attention and keep up the good work. Thanks, everybody.